What would you do if you saw a ghost that no one else could see? Would you run away, or would you stay and try to understand it? This was a question I had asked myself countless times when I read ghost stories by the fire in my little London flat. It seemed harmless then, a puzzle with no real weight, for ghosts belonged in books and fireside tales, not in the daylight streets of the city. But life has a way of answering questions you would rather keep shut. My name is Mary. I was 24 years old when the story began. I had grown up in a modest family in Surrey, then moved to London to work as a secretary in a small law office near Gray's Inn. The work was steady if dull, but it gave me enough for rent, coal, and a few books. Books were my escape. I loved nothing more than sitting in my chair with a novel in hand, losing myself in other lives. Sometimes I imagined that one day I might marry, have a little house, perhaps children of my own. Until then, I had my books, my work, and my quiet routines. I never sought adventure. But adventure, of a sort, found me. It was on a cold, damp morning in November that my employer, Mr. Harris, called me into his office. Mr. Harris was a thin man with sharp eyes and hair gone silver long before its time. He was clever, brisk, and impatient with nonsense. I stood nervously before his desk, expecting to be scolded for some forgotten letter. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "Mary," he said, "I need you to travel to the coast. There has been a death." He explained that one of his clients, an elderly widow named Mrs. Alice Whitmore, had passed away in her great house on the northern coast, Hollowbrook Manor. He had managed her affairs for years, but with so many matters demanding his attention in London, he wished to send me in his place. "You will attend the funeral," he said matter-of-factly. "Then you will go to the manor, sort through her papers, and bring back anything of importance." Simple enough. "Alone?" I asked, startled. "Yes," he said briskly. "I cannot spare anyone else. You are young and capable. You will manage." I did not feel capable. I had never traveled on business, never attended the funeral of a stranger. The thought of walking alone through some echoing country house filled me with unease. Yet I could not bring myself to refuse. So I nodded, took the envelope he handed me, and agreed. That envelope was heavy in my lap the next morning as I sat on the train at King's Cross Station, bound northward through fog and rain. On it was written, "I watched London fade into grey mist, its rooftops and chimneys swallowed by fog. The countryside blurred past, fields dark with November damp." At a small station I changed trains, boarding a slower, older carriage bound toward the coast. Across from me sat a large man with a red face and thick hands. He glanced at the envelope and raised his brows. "You go to that place?" he asked. "Yes," I said, trying to sound confident. "I work for a law office. I must attend the funeral." He leaned back, studying me. "Then you'll be the only one there," he said quietly. I tried to smile. "Why do you say that?" "Because no one in our village will go near Hollowbrook. It isn't safe. Remember my words." His eyes were dark, serious, and he said no more. A chill passed through me that had nothing to do with the damp in the air. I turned to the window, pretending to watch the fields, but his warning echoed in my mind. By evening the train pulled into a little seaside town called Dryford. The air smelled of salt and seaweed, the wind sharp enough to cut through my coat. The man from the train, who introduced himself as Mr. Carter, walked me as far as the Swan Inn, where I would stay. "If you need help, come to me," he said, handing me his card. His voice carried a weight I could not name. That night, in my narrow room at the inn, I dreamed of waves crashing against black rocks. Out of the storm rose the voice of a woman calling for someone who never came. The next morning the sun shone weakly, though the air was still raw. I dressed in my best black suit, for I had no other clothing fit for a funeral. Mr. Carter waited for me below, and together we walked through Dryford Square. People turned as we passed. Their conversations fell silent. Some stared, others looked quickly away. None smiled. I felt suddenly like an intruder in a village that wanted no strangers. The church stood on the edge of the square, its stone walls green with damp. Inside, it was cold and dim. Only 3 of us were present, Mr. Carter, the priest, and myself. No friends, no family, no neighbors. Poor Mrs. Whitmore, I thought. To live so long and die so alone. The service was short. I bowed my head in respect, but when I lifted my eyes I froze. At the back of the church stood a woman. She was clothed all in black, but not in the fashion of our time. Her gown was old-fashioned, heavy, her bonnet wide. Her face was white and drawn, her eyes sunken dark. She stared directly at me. I blinked, startled, and when I glanced at Mr. Carter, he was staring only at the priest. No one else seemed to see her. When the service ended, we stepped into the graveyard. I leaned toward Mr. Carter. "Mr. Carter," I whispered. "Who was that woman in black, at the back of the church?" He stopped dead, his face pale. "What woman?" "She looked very ill." "She was standing." "I saw no woman," he said quickly, and his voice shook. He gripped my arm and hurried me away among the stones. But in my mind her image lingered, that pale face, those hollow eyes fixed on mine. That afternoon a pony cart carried me across Old Tides Crossing, the narrow causeway that led to Hollowbrook Manor. The driver warned that we had only 2 hours before the tide rose and buried the road under water. "Once it's covered," he said, "the house is an island. You'll not leave until morning." I gripped the key in my pocket and tried to steady my nerves. Hollowbrook Manor stood tall and gray on a low rise above the marsh. Behind it stretched miles of empty reeds and water, flat and endless. In front lay the estuary, shining faintly under the pale sun. The house looked beautiful from a distance, but as we drew closer it seemed lifeless. Many windows, but all dark. The driver left me at the gate and turned back at once, his pony trotting fast. I was alone. The silence pressed on me. Only a seabird cried as it wheeled overhead. I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped into a cold, dim hall. Dust lay thick on the furniture, cobwebs hung in corners. Old portraits glared down from the walls. It felt less like a house and more like a tomb. I wandered through rooms heavy with curtains and carved furniture. In the study, piles of papers waited for me, but I had no heart to begin. Instead, I looked out the window toward the marsh. The sun was sinking, turning the water red. And then I saw her. The woman in black. She stood in the little graveyard behind the house, motionless, her face pale as snow. She stared at me with eyes full of hate. I could not move, could not breathe. Then she stepped behind a gravestone and was gone. My knees shook. I wanted to flee, but when I looked toward the causeway it was already lost beneath the rising tide. I was trapped.